welcome to another Purveyor of Light Capture One quick tip. Today we're going to cover exposure warnings within Capture One. This is an underutilized feature, I think, in Capture One, and I think it's pretty darn important. We deal with proper exposure, and we sometimes will blow out the highlights, sometimes we'll muddy up the shadows, and we'd like to avoid those situations. And in Capture One, it's got a great system for showing you exposure and so forth. If I just move my mouse around on this picture, you can see these numbers across the top here. They'll change as I move the cursor. Okay, and they're showing me the RGB values. Okay, anywhere I point on the picture, anywhere. If I pick on a highlight, you can see the numbers change and so forth. This lets me know how things are working. Okay, but Capture One goes a little bit further. Okay, it allows you to take exposure warnings and customize them to your style of photography. So I'm going to show you here. I want you to go ahead and come up, and we'll go into Capture One and go to Settings. And right here under the Exposure tab, okay, so if you're under General, you start here and you hit the Exposure tab. You'll see we have exposure warnings. And by default, it's 250 and 0 for shadows, okay? Now, I myself, I like to be a little cooler. I like to have a little more room, so I go to 245 myself. I want to see an exposure warning at 245 for the highlights. And for the shadows, as we know, 0 is pure black, okay? I like to stay away from pure black for 2, and I like to push myself up to enable the shadow warning, and I like to push that up to, maybe 5 or so. That lets me go, and that lets me set the warnings for exposure, under and over exposure. We also have the settings for the level tool here on how it performs, okay? You can set the targets for the levels the same way, so that when you use the levels tool with inside Capture One, it'll follow those rules if you set your targets in there. By default, it's got auto levels clipping at 0.1%. Okay, you can adjust that and do that. Now, the auto level clipping thresholds, okay, are for the shadows and the highlights by default. Okay, and this allows a small amount of the pixels to be clipped without reducing the overall contrast and dynamic range of the image. So if you want, you can come in and adjust those values here to your style of photography, what you like. Okay, so I recommend you come in here and set that to yourself. For me, like I said, I set my exposure warnings at 245 and 5 on the thing. That gives me a little wiggle room, okay, because there's nothing worse than having a pure white or pure black, especially if you're printing, okay? Because what happens if something's pure white? Let's say it's 255 or beyond. That means there's no information. So when you print it, the printer is printing nothing. And that doesn't look good. So it's always good to have your highlights just a little bit below, okay, 255. All right, so that there's actually something being put down on the paper. All right, so now that we set ourselves for our values, we do that. I like to set up Capture One to be my customized view. I want to change it so it's clicked right here. I can get my warnings right up here. So I'm going to right click on that, and I'm going to say Customize Toolbar. And that's going to bring up here. And now I can choose what tools I want to have. And there's exposure warning right here. I'm going to click, and I'm going to drag it right out. Put it right up there. Okay? So now I have my exposure warning. So now when I'm here, I can click, and you can see I have my exposure warnings. Now let me go to the Adjust menu so I can really push this so you can see it. There. And I'm going to do the same thing for the shadows. Okay. So with exposure warnings off, we have the picture, and we can see our values here. We're not quite 100% black. Here we are 100% black because we're all 4 zeros. If we look at the whitest point, if we turn around and bring in the things, there's the hot spot. And these are the values in the exposure warnings. And remember, my exposure warning was set at 245, okay? And that's why it's going off. I like to be able to see the areas of trouble. Like if you go into her hair, you could see we are starting to muddy up the detail of her hair. And by using these exposure warnings, turning them on, I can now come in and do a very, very accurate adjustment so that I don't lose detail, just like this. And now I have a good exposure on the blacks, and now I just do the exact same thing with the whites. Okay? And depending, I'm hitting a little bit on her arm, and so I adjust accordingly to where I care. Now, I may want to have a little bit of the blotching, like you see in her hair. You can see I'm blotching in here for darks and that, but I find that acceptable for the 90% of the hair is within the targets. And then that helps me on my exposure. So I really do recommend you customize Capture One for yourself. Like I said, go to Capture One, go to Settings, and go to the exposure, and then do your settings. Like I said, by default, it's set for 250 on the highlights and 0 for the shadows. All right. I like it myself. I like a little more wiggle room, so I put it to 245 for that. I do enable shadow warnings, and I put it in at about 5% right there. And those are my personal settings for my particular style. So I highly recommend you set these. It applies to all kinds of things, and I think it'll find it a useful tool in your workflow. Till next week, you guys take care.